Marcus Williams poured dirty water on his wife's head at 3 o'clock in the morning while she sat on their bedroom floor, 9 months pregnant with twins, believing his mother's lies that Nina was faking contractions for attention. The cup had been sitting on the bedside table, left over from cleaning his shoes earlier that evening, and he grabbed it without hesitation, dumping the cold, filthy water directly onto her as she trembled and tried to explain that the pain was real. His mother, Joyce, stood in the doorway, nodding approval. "That's what liars get," Marcus said. Nina said nothing. Water dripped from her hair onto the laptop open behind her, the screen still glowing with an email subject line neither of them bothered to read. Okonkwo Blackstone transaction, final signature required 9 a.m. CST. What Marcus didn't know, what his mother didn't know, what the mistress waiting for his text message didn't know, was that the woman sitting soaked and shaking on that bedroom floor had spent the last 6 hours on encrypted calls with lawyers in Lagos and New York, finalizing the last regulatory approvals for a $10.4 billion sale. Nina Okonkwo Williams was 14 hours away from closing the largest commercial real estate transaction in West African history. The deal would transfer $4.2 billion into her personal account by noon the next day. And Marcus, the man who just called her a liar, the man who managed 14 buildings in Houston he believed belonged to anonymous foreign investors, the man who'd been working 80-hour weeks trying to impress the mystery Okonkwo family, had no idea he'd been reporting to his wife's trustees for the last 18 months. This isn't just a story about a cruel husband who didn't know his wife was a billionaire. It's about what happens when silence is mistaken for weakness, when kindness is weaponized as proof of worthlessness, and when the only person who never needed to prove anything finally decides to let the truth speak. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know this one reaches you. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back to where this really began. Marcus Williams poured dirty water on his wife's head at 3 o'clock in the morning while she sat on their bedroom floor, 9 months pregnant with twins, believing his mother's lies that Nina was faking contractions for attention. The cup had been sitting on the bedside table, left over from cleaning his shoes earlier that evening, and he grabbed it without hesitation, dumping the cold, filthy water directly onto her as she trembled and tried to explain that the pain was real. His mother, Joyce, stood in the doorway, nodding approval. "That's what liars get," Marcus said. Nina said nothing. Water dripped from her hair onto the laptop open behind her, the screen still glowing with an email subject line neither of them bothered to read. Okonkwo Blackstone transaction, final signature required 9 a.m. CST. What Marcus didn't know, what his mother didn't know, what the mistress waiting for his text message didn't know, was that the woman sitting soaked and shaking on that bedroom floor had spent the last 6 hours on encrypted calls with lawyers in Lagos and New York, finalizing the last regulatory approvals for a $10.4 billion sale. Nina Okonkwo Williams was 14 hours away from closing the largest commercial real estate transaction in West African history. The deal would transfer $4.2 billion into her personal account by noon the next day. And Marcus, the man who just called her a liar, the man who managed 14 buildings in Houston he believed belonged to anonymous foreign investors, the man who'd been working 80-hour weeks trying to impress the mystery Okonkwo family, had no idea he'd been reporting to his wife's trustees for the last 18 months. This isn't just a story about a cruel husband who didn't know his wife was a billionaire. It's about what happens when silence is mistaken for weakness, when kindness is weaponized as proof of worthlessness, and when the only person who never needed to prove anything finally decides to let the truth speak. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know this one reaches you. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back to where this really began. Nina stayed on the floor for a long time after they left. The bedroom door had slammed shut 20 minutes ago. She could hear Marcus in the living room now, his voice low and sharp as he complained to Joyce about being woken up, about Nina's dramatics, about how exhausted he was from work. Joyce's response was softer, but still audible through the thin walls. You're too patient with her, baby. She needs to understand the world doesn't revolve around her feelings. The contractions were 7 minutes apart now. Nina timed them on her phone while water from her soaked hair pooled on the hardwood floor beneath her. Her hands moved to her belly, tight and hard beneath her oversized sleep shirt, the fabric now cold and clinging from the dirty water Marcus had poured on her head. She could feel the twins shifting inside her, restless and pressing low. David and Zara. She'd chosen their names months ago, but never told Marcus. He hadn't asked. Her laptop screen had gone dark to save battery. Nina reached for it carefully, her movements slow because standing felt impossible and lying down felt worse. The email was still there when she woke the screen. Subject line, Okonkwo Blackstone transaction. Final signature required 9 a.m. CST. Sender, Amara Nwosu, senior partner, Nwosu and Associates International. The body of the email contained a single sentence and a secure link. Everything is ready. Sign when you're ready. Your father would be proud. Nina's chest tightened painfully. Not from the contractions this time, from something older and deeper. A grief she'd been carrying for 18 months like a second pregnancy. Her father, Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo, dead at 71 from a heart attack that took him in less than 6 minutes, while Nina held his hand in a hospital room 3 miles from where she sat now. He'd built an empire worth $18 billion over 40 years, starting with a single duplex in Lagos in 1983, and he'd left every brick of it to her with a single piece of advice she'd never forgotten. Never let them see your hand until the game is over. Nina whispered the words into the empty bedroom. Her voice was hoarse. She hadn't raised it once tonight, not when Marcus came home drunk at 3 in the morning, not when Joyce called her manipulative, not when the dirty water hit her face and soaked through her clothes. She'd sat there and absorbed it the way she'd absorbed every insult for the last year, every dismissal, every casual cruelty that Marcus and his mother delivered like they were commenting on the weather. But the game was almost over now. In 14 hours, the Blackstone deal would close. In 14 hours, $4.2 billion would transfer into an account Marcus didn't know existed. In 14 hours, the Wall Street Journal would publish an announcement that would make her father's name and hers visible to everyone who'd spent the last 18 months calling her worthless. Marcus thought she was unemployed. He'd been saying it for months, his tone laced with contempt every time someone asked what Nina did. She used to teach elementary school, but she stopped when she got pregnant. Now she just stays home. The unspoken end of that sentence hung in every room they entered together. Now she does nothing. Now she's a burden. Now she lives off my salary while I work 80-hour weeks managing properties for people who actually matter. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Those properties Marcus managed, the 14-building portfolio in Houston that generated $28 million in annual rent, the portfolio he obsessed over and spent sleepless nights trying to optimize, belonged to Nina, every single one. They were part of the smaller American arm of her father's empire, structured through a Delaware LLC so opaque that even Apex Properties Group's corporate attorneys had never connected Nina Williams to Okonkwo Holdings LP. Marcus went to work every day and reported to Nina's trustees. He drafted proposals for Nina's buildings. He approved leases and maintenance budgets and capital improvements for properties Nina owned. And every night he came home and told her she contributed nothing. She didn't know it yet, but that would be the detail that broke him in the end. Not the billions, not the empire, the buildings, the fact that everything he thought he'd built his career on had been hers all along. Another contraction rolled through her, stronger this time, and Nina closed her laptop before the pain made her hands shake too badly to hold it. She wouldn't tell Marcus about the contractions. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either. She'd learned over the last 2 years of marriage that asking Marcus for help only gave him another opportunity to remind her how much she needed him, how little she offered in return. Nina dried her face with the towel Marcus had left crumpled on the floor earlier. Then she lay down, not on the bed, which was too high and too soft for her aching back, but on the floor beside it, her head resting on the towel, her phone clutched in one hand in case the contractions got close enough together that she'd need to call someone who actually cared whether she made it to the hospital alive. Her cousin, probably. Not her husband. The apartment was quiet now. Marcus and Joyce had stopped talking. Nina closed her eyes and thought about her father's briefcase. The worn leather one with his initials embossed on the front. The one he'd carried to his first property closing in Lagos 41 years ago. It was in her closet now, hidden behind winter coats Marcus never looked at. Inside it, the original duplex deed, a photograph of her father standing in front of the building with his hand on the door, and a handwritten letter he'd left for her the week before he died. The letter said, "Does he love you, or does he love what he thinks you are? Let him show you." Marcus had shown her. To understand how a billionaire came to be soaked in dirty water on her bedroom floor, we need to go back 18 months, to the day Nina's father died and left her an empire she'd never asked for. Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo died in Methodist Hospital on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 18 months before his daughter would sit on a bedroom floor soaked in dirty water while holding an empire he'd spent 40 years building. Nina was 26 years old and holding her father's hand when the monitor flatlined. The nurse, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd been checking his vitals every 30 minutes for the last 6 hours, stepped forward and placed her hand gently on Nina's shoulder. Nina didn't move. She kept holding her father's hand until it went cold. The heart attack had taken him fast. 6 minutes from the first chest pain to complete cardiac arrest. He'd been conscious for 4 of those minutes, long enough to ask the nurses to give him privacy with his daughter, long enough to say the things he'd been saving for a moment he must have known was coming. "There are things you need to know," he'd said, his voice already thin and strained, his free hand reaching for the briefcase he'd insisted the ambulance drivers bring from his car. "About what I'm leaving you. About what it means." Nina had tried to stop him. "Papa, don't. Save your strength. The doctors said—" "The doctors are wrong." His grip on her hand tightened with surprising force. "I have 4 minutes, maybe 5. Listen to me." So she'd listened. Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo had built Okonkwo Global Holdings, starting with a single duplex in Lagos in 1983. He'd been 29 years old with $700 in savings and a vision nobody believed in. 40 years later, the empire spanned 127 properties across Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. The crown jewel was Okonkwo Tower, a 74-story mixed-use complex in Lagos worth $3.2 billion alone, leased to tech companies and multinational corporations and foreign embassies that paid rent in American dollars. The Meridian Business Park in Accra, the Victoria Island Commercial District in Lagos, office buildings and retail centers and luxury apartment complexes that generated revenue every single day, whether Chief Okonkwo was alive or dead. Total portfolio value, $18 billion. "It's yours," he told Nina. His breathing labored now, the monitor beeping erratically behind him. All of it, structured through an irrevocable trust, managed by trustees in Lagos and Houston, protected from anyone who didn't build it. Nina's chest had tightened. "Papa, I don't—" "You do." He tapped the briefcase twice with his free hand. A habit he'd had for as long as Nina could remember, something he did before every important conversation. "There's also the American portfolio, 14 buildings in Houston, smaller but profitable, $28 million in annual rent. I set them up separately. Delaware LLC, Okonkwo Holdings LP. So opaque even lawyers won't connect your married name to the entity." His eyes had sharpened despite the pain. "Does Marcus know about any of this?" Nina had hesitated. "He knows you were successful. He thinks you left me comfortable. Maybe a few million. And you let him think that. I didn't want—" Nina's voice had cracked. "I wanted him to love me, not what I'd inherit." Something had softened in her father's face then. His breathing was getting worse. The monitor was screaming now. But he'd squeezed her hand one more time and said the words that would stay with her through everything that came after. "Never let them see your hand until the game is over. I started with one duplex in 1983. 41 years later, they still don't know what I own. That's power, Nina. Not the buildings, not the money. The choice of when to show it." His breath caught. "Does he love you, or does he love what he thinks you are? Let him show you." Then the nurses had rushed back in, and Nina had been gently moved aside, and her father had died before she could answer him. The irony is this. Marcus had been the one to insist Nina go to Houston for her father's final days instead of staying in Lagos for the funeral planning. "You need to be practical," he'd said over the phone when Nina called him from the hospital. "Your family has people to handle the arrangements. I need you here. We have that work dinner Friday I told you about." The work dinner was with Shayla, though Nina wouldn't learn that until months later. 3 years earlier, when Marcus and Nina had first married, he'd been different. A junior analyst at a mid-tier firm, working 60-hour weeks because he believed hard work would carry him somewhere his Fifth Ward upbringing hadn't. He used to cook dinner with Nina on Sundays. Nothing fancy, just pasta and garlic bread, and a bottle of cheap wine they'd split while talking about the future. He used to ask about her third graders at the Title I school where she taught. He used to touch her face when he kissed her goodbye in the mornings. He'd signed the prenup without reading it carefully because Nina had framed it as family protocol. Something her father insisted on, nothing personal. Marcus had flipped through the 40-page document, skimmed the first few clauses about separate property, and signed on page 38 next to Nina's neat signature. The document established complete separation of assets. It waived all claims to premarital and inherited wealth. It protected everything Chief Okonkwo had built from ever being considered marital property. Marcus never asked what, specifically, he was waiving. He'd assumed Nina's family had a few million, maybe 10 at most. Comfortable, but not extraordinary. Nina had never corrected him. What they didn't know, what Nina herself hadn't fully known until her father's deathbed, was that the test had already begun. Nina stood in the back of the cathedral in Lagos 5 days later, wearing traditional mourning attire, white lace and coral beads, her hair wrapped in geil, her face composed despite the grief pressing against her ribs like a physical weight. Hundreds of people filled the pews, Nigerian business leaders, government officials, CEOs of companies her father had quietly owned pieces of for decades. The president of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce gave a eulogy. The British High Commissioner sent a representative. There were wreaths from corporations Nina had never heard of and condolence cards in 4 different languages. Marcus hadn't come. He'd said he couldn't get the time off work. Nina returned to Houston alone 6 days after her father died, carrying his briefcase and a secret worth $18 billion. Marcus picked her up from George Bush Intercontinental Airport in his leased Audi, the one he'd upgraded to 3 months earlier because image matters in commercial real estate, and complained about traffic the entire drive home. He didn't ask about the funeral. He didn't ask how Nina was holding up. He talked about a property management opportunity that had just opened up at Apex Properties Group, a firm he'd been trying to break into for 2 years, and how this could finally be his shot at managing institutional-grade assets. What Marcus didn't notice, the briefcase Nina held in her lap had his future inside it. He just didn't know it yet. The marriage didn't collapse all at once. It eroded the way Houston summers erode paint, slowly, through accumulated heat and exposure, until what looked solid from a distance turned out to be paper-thin underneath. Marcus got the job at Apex Properties Group 6 weeks after Nina's father's funeral. He came home that June evening with champagne and news. He'd been assigned to manage their institutional portfolio, 14 commercial buildings generating $28 million in annual rent. The client was listed in his contract as Okonkwo Holdings LP, anonymous foreign investors, his new boss had explained. Very private, very hands-off. Just deliver the quarterly reports and keep the buildings profitable. Marcus didn't notice Nina go pale when he said the name. "This is it," he'd told her that night, pacing their small living room with an energy she hadn't seen in months. "This is my shot. If I can prove myself on the Okonkwo portfolio, I'm set. These people own prime real estate in Midtown, the Galleria, the medical center. Whoever they are, they're serious players." Nina had smiled and poured the champagne. She didn't tell him that every building he'd just listed belonged to her. She didn't tell him that the trustees he'd be reporting to, names he'd never recognized, law firms based in Lagos and Delaware, answered to her. She just raised her glass and said, "I'm proud of you." What they didn't know was this. Marcus would spend the next year and a half trying to impress the woman sitting across from him while systematically destroying everything they'd built together. The obsession started immediately. Marcus began working 80-hour weeks, coming home after Nina had gone to bed and leaving before she woke up. When he was home, he talked about nothing but the Okonkwo portfolio. Who were these people? How did they build this? What would it take to meet them face to face? He fantasized aloud about the kind of people who owned that much Houston real estate and stayed completely anonymous. Old oil money, maybe. International industrialists. Maybe even royalty from somewhere. Nina listened. She didn't correct him. She was 6 weeks pregnant and hadn't told him yet because the right moment never seemed to come. By August, Marcus had stopped cooking Sunday dinners. By September, he'd stopped asking about her day. By October, when Nina finally told him about the baby, he'd looked up from his laptop for maybe 5 seconds and said, "That's great. We should talk about it later. I have this report due for the Okonkwo trustees tomorrow." Then Joyce moved in. Just temporarily, Marcus had said in November, when his mother called saying she'd been evicted from her Fifth Ward apartment due to building renovations the landlord was doing. She needs a place to stay while she finds something new. It'll be a few weeks. It had now been 7 months. Joyce slept on their couch because Nina didn't keep a clean enough guest room. Never mind that their second bedroom was full of Marcus's work files and gym equipment he never used. Joyce measured worth in visible markers. Designer bags, new cars, square footage. She'd spent 40 years cleaning houses in River Oaks, watching wealthy women live lives she'd never access. And she'd poured all of that deprivation into raising Marcus as proof that poverty didn't have to be permanent. When she looked at Nina, soft-bodied, quiet Nina who taught elementary school and wore Old Navy maternity clothes and seemed content with their small, third ward apartment, she saw dead weight. "Don't you think Marcus deserves better than this?" Joyce had asked one morning in February, gesturing around their kitchen while Nina made tea. The question was rhetorical. The answer was already decided. Marcus started parroting his mother's language. Nina's teaching job became cute instead of meaningful. Her exhaustion became laziness. Her requests for help became demands. And Shayla Hawthorne, Apex's VP of Acquisitions, all sharp edges and polished confidence, became the constant comparison point. "Shayla closes deals," Marcus said once, not looking up from his phone. "She's driven, ambitious. She gets it." Nina was 5 months pregnant. Her ankles were swollen. She'd spent the day teaching third graders how to multiply fractions and had come home to find Joyce had rearranged the kitchen cabinets to be more efficient. She didn't respond to Marcus. She just went to the bedroom and closed the door. The affair evidence accumulated the way water damage spreads, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. A hotel receipt in Marcus's suit pocket when Nina was doing laundry. The Houstonian Hotel, one night, $473. "Work event," he'd said when she asked. "Investor dinner ran late." Shayla's name appearing in his text notifications 20, 30 times a day. Nina didn't read the messages. She didn't need to. The frequency told her everything. Marcus showering immediately when he came home, something he'd never done before. The way he angled his phone screen away from her when they were in the same room. The new cologne, the fresh haircuts every 2 weeks instead of every month. Nina doubted herself before she doubted him. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe pregnancy hormones were making her see patterns that weren't there. Maybe this was just what happened when marriages went through difficult patches and someone's mother moved onto their couch and work got stressful. But then she found Marcus's calendar synced to the iPad he'd left on the kitchen counter. March 15th through 17th. Napa, investor meeting. She'd opened Instagram on her phone, Shayla's public profile. March 16th, a photo of wine glasses against Vineyard Hills, caption celebrating successful partnerships. Nina screenshot everything. The calendar entry, the Instagram post, the credit card statement showing Marcus had charged dinner at Pappas Brothers Steakhouse, $340 for 2 people, to their joint account the week of Shayla's birthday. By June, Nina was 7 months pregnant and had 6 months of evidence saved in an encrypted folder on her phone. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges. A Miami trip Marcus had said was a real estate conference that matched exactly with Shayla's vacation photos. $2,400 charged as business development to the joint account that held $6,400 of Marcus's salary and $1,200 Nina had deposited from her teaching stipend. She never confronted him. She never asked questions. She just documented and waited and felt something inside her go cold and still. Nina sat alone in the apartment one evening in late October, 7 months pregnant, scrolling through the evidence on her phone while Marcus worked late and Joyce watched television in the living room. The files were organized by date, chronological proof of a marriage ending in real time. She touched her rounded belly where the twins were moving, restless, pressing against her ribs, alive and dependent and completely unaware that their father was building a life that didn't include any of them. Nina whispered into the empty bedroom. "He doesn't know what I am. He never asked." The Blackstone negotiations began in August. Nina never told Marcus. She conducted every call from the apartment while he was at work, every offshore meeting disguised as visits to her cousin in New York. By November, the deal was nearly closed, and then Nina went into labor. Nina woke at 5 in the morning on November 17th with a contraction that felt like her entire abdomen was being squeezed in a vice. She lay still in the dark, one hand on her rounded belly, timing it on her phone. 38 seconds. When it passed, she checked the time and waited. 6 minutes later, another one came. Marcus was asleep beside her, turned away, his phone charging on the nightstand. Nina reached over carefully and shook his shoulder. "Marcus, I think I need to go to the hospital." He groaned and pulled the pillow over his head. "What time is it?" 5:15. The contractions are 6 minutes apart. Marcus sat up slowly, reaching for his phone. The screen lit his face in the dark bedroom. Nina watched him scroll through something, his calendar probably, or his email. His expression tightened. "Nina, I have a critical investor call at 9. The Okonkwo trustees specifically requested this meeting. I can't miss it." The contraction came again. Nina breathed through it, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress. When she could speak, her voice came out thin. "I'm 34 weeks pregnant with twins. The contractions are regular. I need to go now." "You're overreacting." Marcus set his phone down and rubbed his face. "This is typical first pregnancy panic. My mom had 3 babies. She'd tell you the same thing." As if summoned, Joyce appeared in the bedroom doorway, her thin frame backlit by the living room lamp she'd left on all night. She'd been sleeping on their couch for 7 months. She never knocked. "What's all the noise?" "Nina thinks she's in labor," Marcus said, his tone making it clear what he thought of that. Joyce stepped into the room, arms crossed. "I had 3 babies, Nina. Trust me, you're fine. First-time mothers always think every little twinge means something. Marcus has important work. You can wait a few hours." Nina's chest tightened, not from a contraction this time, from something colder and more final. She looked at Marcus. He was already checking his phone again, scrolling through what looked like meeting notes. She looked at Joyce. The older woman's face was set in that expression Nina had come to know well over the last months. Concern performed for Marcus's benefit, contempt reserved for Nina. Nina reached for her own phone and opened her contacts. She scrolled past Marcus's name to the one below it, Keisha Williams, her cousin. She pressed call. "I'll get myself there," Nina said quietly. Marcus didn't look up from his phone. Keisha arrived 20 minutes later and helped Nina down the stairs to her car. Joyce watched from the living room window, but didn't offer to help. Marcus had gone back to sleep. At Texas Children's Hospital, a nurse named Jennifer Rodriguez checked Nina's vitals and examined her. "You're dilated to 4 centimeters, she said, her voice professionally calm but her eyes kind. "We're admitting you. Is your husband on his way?" "He's coming," Nina said. It was easier than explaining. The contractions got worse. By 9:30, Nina was dilated to 7 centimeters, and the pain had become something she couldn't breathe through anymore. The anesthesiologist came and went. The epidural helped. The nurses rotated shifts. Jennifer left at noon. A new nurse, Michelle Chen, asked gently at 1:15, "Is your husband coming?" Nina didn't answer. She just closed her eyes. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Nina delivered twins alone in a delivery room that smelled like antiseptic and had fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and cold. David came first, 4 pounds, 3 ounces, tiny and red and screaming. Then Zara, 4 pounds, 1 ounce, quieter than her brother, but breathing. Both were premature. Both went to the NICU immediately. Nina held David for 90 seconds before they took him. She held Zara for 90 seconds before they took her. Then she was alone in the delivery room, her body shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and something that felt like grief, and no one was there to see her cry. The scene softened into something quieter. At 4:15, Nina's phone buzzed on the bedside table. She reached for it with trembling hands. The notification was from her Chase private client account. Transaction completed, $4,200,000,000 deposited. Beneath it, an email from Amara Nwosu with a single line. It's done. The WSJ publishes tomorrow at 6 a.m. ST. Rest now. Nina stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. While she'd been delivering her children alone, the largest real estate transaction in West African history had closed. Everything her father had built over 40 years, every property, every contract, every carefully structured trust, had transferred to Blackstone's consortium, and Nina had just become one of the wealthiest women in Houston. Marcus arrived at 11:30 that night. Nina was in a recovery room by then, hooked to an IV, her body sore in ways she hadn't known were possible. He walked in smelling like wine and wearing the same clothes he'd had on that morning. His first words were, "I can't believe you didn't wait." Nina stared at him. "What?" "I missed the birth. You could have held on a few more hours." He sat in the chair by the window, not the one next to her bed. "The investor call ran long, and then Shayla." He caught himself. "Then the team wanted to debrief. This Okonkwo deal is getting real traction. I couldn't just leave." He didn't apologize. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask about David and Zara, still in the NICU 2 floors up, still too small to breathe completely on their own. Nina closed her eyes and said nothing. Joyce arrived the next morning at 8. She walked into the recovery room, looked around with an expression of distaste, and said, "This is where you chose to give birth?" Marcus was getting coffee. Joyce didn't wait for him. She stood by the window and started talking in that voice she used when she wanted to sound concerned, but needed Marcus to hear her certainty. Nina heard it through the partially open door to the hallway where Joyce had stepped to take a phone call. "She's going to be unstable now. Postpartum hormones. This is your chance to get ahead of custody issues. My lawyer says if you file first while she's weak, you'll have leverage. Get the apartment, get primary custody, make her pay you support while you build your career. She's got nothing, Marcus. No job, no prospects. You're the one with the future." Nina heard Marcus's voice quieter. "You think that would work?" "I know it would work." Nina picked up her phone and opened the voice memo app. She'd started recording the moment Joyce's tone had shifted. The entire conversation was there, crystal clear. She sent it to herself via encrypted email. Then she opened her browser and pulled up the Wall Street Journal. The article had published 20 minutes ago. Blackstone acquires Nigerian real estate giant Okonkwo Global Holdings in $10.4 billion deal. There was a photo of Nina signing documents in a New York conference room, her father's briefcase visible on the table beside her. Her name listed as Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo's sole heir and the transaction's principal. Nina screenshot the article. She screenshot the bank notification. She screenshot everything. Michelle Chen, the nurse, came in to check her vitals. "How are you feeling?" Nina looked at her phone, then at the doorway where Joyce and Marcus were still talking about how to take her children and her home and leave her with nothing. "I'm done," Nina said. Nina stayed in the hospital for 3 days. Marcus visited twice. When she came home, Joyce was still there, sleeping on the couch. Nina sat in the nursery alone and opened her contacts. She scrolled to a name she hadn't called in months. Amara Nwosu, her father's attorney. Nina sat in the nursery at 3 in the morning, 2 weeks postpartum, holding David in one arm and Zara in the other. Both twins were asleep, their tiny bodies warm against her chest, their breathing soft and even. Marcus was in the bedroom sleeping. Joyce was on the couch. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic on Elgin Street. Nina's body still ached. Her breasts were sore from nursing. Her incision site throbbed when she moved too quickly. She'd gained 40 pounds during the pregnancy and lost maybe 10. Her soft belly pressed against the waistband of her pajama pants. Her hips felt wider. Her arms, which she'd learned years ago to keep covered in long sleeves around Joyce, felt heavy with exhaustion. She didn't cry. She'd done all her crying alone in the hospital. Now she just sat in the dim nursery light and held her children and listened to the recording she'd made in the recovery room. Joyce's voice came through tinny but clear on her phone. She's going to be unstable now. Postpartum hormones. This is your chance to get ahead of custody issues. My lawyer says if you file first while she's weak, you'll have leverage. Marcus's voice quieter. You think that would work? I know it would work. Get the apartment. Get primary custody. Make her pay you support while you build your career. Nina stopped the playback. She'd heard it 17 times in the last 2 weeks. She had it memorized. Every pause, every inflection, every casual cruelty delivered in the hallway outside her hospital room while she'd held her newborns and bled and tried to remember how to stand up without her legs shaking. A memory surfaced, her father's deathbed, his hand gripping hers, his voice already fading. Does he love you, or does he love what he thinks you are? Let him show you. Marcus had shown her. He'd poured dirty water on her head 3 weeks ago while she sat in labor. He'd refused to take her to the hospital. He'd arrived 11 hours after she'd delivered his children and complained that she hadn't waited. He'd spent the last 2 weeks working late, coming home to sleep, leaving before the twins woke up. He hadn't changed a diaper, hadn't warmed a bottle, hadn't asked if Nina needed help or rest or anything at all. And now he was planning to take her children and her home and leave her with nothing. Something inside Nina went cold and still and absolutely certain. She laid David and Zara carefully in their shared crib. They slept better together, the NICU nurses had said. Twins often did, and walked to the small desk in the corner of the nursery where she'd set up her laptop. Her movements were slow and deliberate. No trembling, no uncertainty, just clarity that felt like ice water in her veins. She opened her email and typed a message to Amara Nwosu. Subject: Meeting request. Urgent body. I need to see you tomorrow. Bring everything on the Houston properties and the Blackstone transaction. It's time. She hit send at 3:14 in the morning. The response came back at 3:16. Amara never slept much. 10 a.m., my office. I'll be ready. The next morning, Nina told Marcus she had a pediatrician appointment for the twins. He didn't look up from his phone. Joyce offered to come along to make sure you're handling things properly. Nina said the doctor preferred to see mothers alone for the first postpartum visit. It wasn't true, but Joyce didn't know that. Nina drove to Amara's office in the Galleria area, the twins sleeping in their car seats, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Amara's practice occupied a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Westheimer Road. The receptionist recognized Nina and waved her straight through. Amara stood when Nina entered, her silver locks pulled back, her tailored suit a deep emerald that looked expensive even from across the room. She didn't smile. She just gestured to the chair across from her desk and said, "Show me." Nina played the recording. Then she opened her phone and showed Amara 6 months of evidence: the hotel receipts, the restaurant charges, the calendar entries that matched Shayla's Instagram posts, the Miami trip charged to their joint account, the screenshots, the timestamps, everything organized chronologically in a folder labeled Documentation. Amara listened to the entire hospital recording without interrupting. When it finished, she set her hands flat on her desk and looked at Nina with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite anger, but something colder and more final. "Do you want to wound him, or do you want to end this?" Nina didn't hesitate. "End it. Completely." Amara nodded once. "The Apex all-hands meeting is December 5th. Blackstone will be there to discuss the integration opportunity. The CEO is already excited about managing the Okonkwo portfolio's U.S. expansion." She paused. "That's where we do this. In front of everyone? In front of everyone who matters. His colleagues, his boss, the Blackstone representatives, and your mother-in-law if she insists on attending." Amara's voice was perfectly level. "Marcus has been telling people for 18 months that he manages properties for the Okonkwo family. He's been positioning himself as the bridge to a major client. When you walk into that meeting, everything he's built his identity on disappears." Nina's hands were steady in her lap. "What happens to him?" "He'll lose his job. Apex will terminate him for cause once we present the evidence of misappropriated funds. Blackstone will file complaints with the Texas Real Estate Commission. His professional reputation will be destroyed. Amara's eyes didn't leave Nina's face. He'll lose everything he thought he built because it was never his. Nina thought about Marcus pouring water on her head. She thought about him refusing to take her to the hospital. She thought about him sitting in a chair by the window instead of by her bedside, complaining that she hadn't waited to give birth until his schedule cleared. She thought about Joyce's voice on that recording. Make her pay you support while you build your career. Good, Nina said. Amara began pulling files. They spent the next hour reviewing documents, trust structures, corporate ownership records, the Wall Street Journal article that had published 2 weeks ago with Nina's photo, the forensic accounting that showed exactly how Marcus had used company funds to benefit Shayla, the lease agreement for the apartment Marcus thought he'd be taking in a divorce, owned by Okonkwo Holdings LP, owned by Nina. When Nina left Amara's office at noon, the twins were still sleeping peacefully in their car seats. She drove home carefully, parked in the garage, and sat in silence for 5 minutes with the engine off. She whispered the words her father had taught her, the ones she'd been carrying for 18 months like a card held close to her chest. Never let them see your hand until the game is over. Then she added, her voice steady and cold, the game is over. For 2 weeks, Nina said nothing. She smiled when Marcus came home. She nodded when Joyce criticized her. She fed the twins and let them think she was weak. On December 5th, she got dressed. The Apex Properties Group conference room on the 14th floor of the Bank of America Center smelled like fresh coffee and expensive cologne. Marcus arrived at 9:45, 15 minutes early. Wearing his best suit, the charcoal Tom Ford he'd bought on credit because image mattered in commercial real estate. He'd gotten a fresh haircut the day before. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Joyce sat in the back row of chairs, her thin frame rigid with anticipation. She'd insisted on coming. I want to see what my son has built, she'd said that morning. Marcus hadn't argued. He wanted her to see it too. Shayla Hawthorne sat 3 seats down from Marcus in the front row, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She wore a burgundy sheath dress and kept leaning over to whisper observations about the Blackstone representatives who'd be presenting. Her perfume, something floral and expensive, drifted between them. Marcus checked his phone compulsively, scrolling through the meeting agenda Apex's CEO had circulated. Okonkwo Portfolio Expansion Opportunity. This was it. 18 months of 80-hour weeks, of optimizing occupancy rates and tenant retention, of preparing quarterly reports that he'd obsessed over like they were dissertation chapters. The Okonkwo family, whoever they were, had finally noticed. Blackstone wanted Apex to manage the U.S. integration of their global assets, and Marcus, who'd been managing their Houston properties flawlessly, was about to be recognized as the bridge to a client worth billions. The CEO, Richard Carmichael, stood at the front of the room at exactly 10 o'clock and began his presentation. 63 people filled the conference room, every property manager, every analyst, the entire acquisitions team. Today marks a transformative moment for Apex Properties Group, Carmichael said, his voice carrying that practiced executive cadence. Our exemplary management of the Okonkwo Houston portfolio has caught the attention of major institutional investors. Marcus felt Shayla's hand brush his arm. She smiled. Joyce in the back row sat up straighter. Then the door opened. Amara Nwosu walked in first, wearing an emerald suit with subtle gold threading that caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her silver locks were pulled back. She moved with the kind of stillness that made people stop talking. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits with Blackstone lanyards clipped to their lapels entered and stood on either side of the door. Carmichael stopped mid-sentence. I'm sorry, we're in the middle of... Richard. Amara's voice was calm and precise, with the faint trace of a Nigerian accent. I'm Amara Nwosu, counsel for the Okonkwo family estate. We'd like to introduce the beneficial owner of Okonkwo Global Holdings, who completed the transaction with Blackstone on November 18th. The room went completely silent. Amara stepped aside. Nina walked through the door. She wore traditional Nigerian attire, Aso Oke in royal blue and gold, the fabric wrapped and folded in the formal style her father had taught her years ago, the kind worn to important ceremonies and funerals and moments that required dignity. Her hair was in braids pulled back from her face. She pushed a double stroller ahead of her. David and Zara, 3 weeks old, slept peacefully in matching onesies. Marcus's face drained of all color. His mouth opened but no sound came out. His hands, which had been resting on the table in front of him, went completely still. Joyce stood up in the back row. "What is this?" Shayla turned in her seat, her expression shifting from confusion to something sharper as her eyes moved from Nina to Marcus and back. Nina stood at the front of the room beside Amara and didn't say anything. She just positioned the stroller carefully, set the brake, and waited. Amara placed a folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood surface was the only noise in the room. "This is the Wall Street Journal, November 19th. She opened to a full-page article with a photo. Nina in a New York conference room, signing documents. Her father's worn leather briefcase visible on the table beside her. The headline read, "Blackstone acquires Nigerian real estate giant Okonkwo Global Holdings in $10.4 billion deal." Marcus leaned forward. His eyes scanned the photo, the headline, the opening paragraph that identified Nina Okonkwo Williams as Chief Emmanuel Okonkwo's sole heir and the transaction's principal. Amara placed a second folder on the table. Trust documents showing Miss Okonkwo Williams inherited Okonkwo Global Holdings, 127 properties valued at $18 billion before the sale, in May of 2023. She paused. 18 months ago. Someone in the back of the room inhaled sharply. Amara opened a third folder. Corporate ownership records for Okonkwo Holdings LP, the Delaware entity that owns the 14 buildings in Houston that Marcus Williams has been managing. She looked directly at Marcus. "Ms. Okonkwo Williams is the sole beneficial owner. You've been reporting to her trustees since June of 2023. Marcus's hands started trembling. "That's not..." His voice cracked. "Nina, what is she..." "Let her finish," Nina said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was steady. Amara placed a fourth folder down. Expense reports showing Marcus Williams approved $47,000 in fraudulent consultant fees to Shayla Hawthorne for work that was never performed. Shayla stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I don't know what this is, but I'm not..." Amara didn't look at her. She opened the final folder. Forensic accounting analysis showing Marcus Williams used Apex Company funds to lease Ms. Hawthorne a luxury apartment in Miss Okonkwo Williams's Galleria building at a 60% discount, a discount he had no authority to grant. Estimated loss to the property owner, $84,000 over 12 months. The room erupted into whispers. Carmichael stood frozen at the front, his face pale. Amara's voice cut through the noise. "One more thing." She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "The apartment Marcus Williams currently resides in, 2-bedroom unit in 3rd Ward." She set the deed on the table. "Owned by Okonkwo Holdings LP since 2019. Mr. Williams has been living rent-free in his wife's property for 4 years. Marcus made a sound like all the air had left his body. One of the Blackstone representatives stepped forward. His voice was corporate and final. "Given these findings, Blackstone is terminating all discussions with Apex Properties Group regarding the Okonkwo portfolio integration. We'll be pursuing legal remedies for the misappropriated funds." Joyce started screaming. "This is a setup. My son would never..." Shayla grabbed her purse and moved toward the door. Amara stepped into her path. "Miss Hawthorne, you're named in the unjust enrichment complaint. I'll need you to stay." Shayla's face went white. Marcus finally stood. He looked at Nina. His eyes were red. Nina, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you were..." He stopped. His hands reached toward her across the table. "Please, let me explain. This is all a mistake." Nina looked at him. She didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there beside the stroller where her children slept, wearing her father's colors, and said, "You poured dirty water on the woman who owns the roof over your head." The room went silent again. Nina turned to Carmichael. "I'm withdrawing my Houston properties from Apex's management, effective immediately. You'll receive formal notice from my trustees this afternoon." Then she released the brake on the stroller, turned, and walked out of the conference room. Amara stayed behind. She handed Marcus a manila envelope. "Termination paperwork, effective immediately." She handed Shayla a second envelope. Legal notice regarding the unjust enrichment claim and lease violation. Nina pushed the stroller down the hallway to the elevator. Through the conference room's glass walls, she could see Marcus being approached by security. Joyce was shouting at Carmichael. Shayla was on her phone, crying. Nina pressed the button for the parking garage and didn't look back. The collapse happened faster than Marcus could process. By the end of the week, there was nothing left. Marcus Williams was blacklisted from Houston commercial real estate by the second week of December. Apex's internal investigation confirmed everything Amera had presented: the fraudulent consultant fees, the unauthorized lease discount, the misappropriation of company funds. Blackstone filed formal complaints with the Texas Real Estate Commission. By Christmas, Marcus's professional reputation was destroyed. He sold his leased Audi to cover legal fees. He moved out of the Third Ward apartment, Nina's apartment, the one he'd been living in rent-free for 4 years, and into a studio in Montrose with water-stained ceilings and neighbors who played music until 3 in the morning. He sent 47 text messages to Nina over the course of 3 weeks, each one more desperate than the last. Please let me explain. I didn't know about the buildings. I never meant to hurt you. The kids need their father. Nina forwarded every message to Amara and blocked his number. Shayla Hawthorne moved to Dallas in January. The discounted lease on her Galleria apartment, the one Marcus had approved without authorization, the one in Nina's building, was revoked effective immediately. Nina's trustees filed a lawsuit for $84,000 in unjust enrichment, the difference between market rate and what Marcus had been charging her. Shayla settled out of court for $60,000 and signed a non-disclosure agreement. She blocked Marcus's number 2 days after the Apex meeting. He tried calling from different phones. She never answered. Joyce stopped calling after Nina's trustees sent her a cease and desist letter for harassment in mid-January. She went back to Fifth Ward and told her neighbors that her son had been betrayed by a gold digger who'd hidden her family's money to trap him. Nobody who'd seen the Wall Street Journal article believed her. Joyce didn't call Marcus much after that either. Marcus had supervised visitation with David and Zara every other Saturday. 2 hours at a neutral location, a family center in Midtown with fluorescent lights and plastic toys and a court-appointed supervisor who sat in the corner taking notes. He showed up late most weeks. He left early when the twins cried. By March, he'd missed 3 visits entirely. The scene shifted into something quieter. Nina bought a restored Victorian mansion in River Oaks in February. 3 stories, original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a garden in the back that got morning sun. She paid cash. It was a fraction of what she'd received from Blackstone, barely a rounding error on the $4.2 billion that had been wired to her account in November. She started the Emmanuel Okonkwo Foundation in March, $500 million dedicated to funding education for girls in Nigeria and Ghana. Scholarships for secondary school, university grants, teacher training programs. The foundation's offices were in a building Nina owned in the Galleria, not one of the 14 Marcus had managed, but one of the others her father had quietly acquired over the years. David and Zara were 6 months old in April, healthy, thriving, hitting every milestone the pediatrician charted at their checkups. David had started laughing, a deep belly laugh that came when Nina made silly faces at him during diaper changes. Zara had just learned to roll over and was working on sitting up unassisted. They slept in a nursery on the 2nd floor of the River Oaks house, a bright room with cream-colored walls and windows that overlooked the garden. Nina worked from home most days, managing foundation operations and the residual Okonkwo investments she'd retained after the Blackstone sale. She took calls from her father's old business partners in Lagos. She reviewed grant applications. She interviewed candidates for the foundation's board of directors. She did it all from a desk in the corner of her bedroom while the twins napped. And when they woke up, she closed her laptop and became just their mother again. On a Thursday afternoon in late April, Nina sat in the nursery holding her father's old briefcase. The leather was worn smooth in places, cracked along the edges, with his initials, E.O., embossed on the front in faded gold lettering. He'd carried it to his first property closing in Lagos in 1983, and he'd carried it to every important meeting for 41 years after that. Nina opened it carefully. Inside, the original deed to the duplex in Lagos, where everything had started, creased and yellowed with age. In a photograph, her father at 29, standing in front of that duplex with his hand on the door, smiling like he just won something no one else knew was a prize yet. She thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, sitting on a bedroom floor in a different house, soaked in dirty water, 9 months pregnant and afraid. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, delivering twins alone in a hospital while a $4 billion deal closed in the background. She thought about Marcus, who'd poured water on her head and refused to take her to the hospital and planned to take her children and her home because he'd believed she had nothing. Nina whispered into the quiet nursery, "I kept my hand hidden, Papa. The game is over." She closed the briefcase and set it on the shelf above the changing table next to the framed photo of her father in his traditional attire at the opening of Okonkwo Tower. Then she picked up Zara from the crib. David was still sleeping, and walked to the window. Outside, the garden was blooming. Azaleas in pink and white. Gardenias that would smell like summer when they opened fully. A magnolia tree the previous owners had planted decades ago, its branches heavy with waxy white flowers. This story was never about revenge. It was about what happens when people mistake silence for weakness, when they confuse kindness with powerlessness, and when they build their lives on assumptions about who deserves to own what. Marcus had thought the buildings, the apartment, the career, the control, all of it belonged to him because Nina never corrected him. But silence isn't surrender, and sometimes the person holding everything together is the same person everyone forgot to see. If you've ever been underestimated, ever been dismissed, ever had someone look right through you because they couldn't imagine you held power they'd never possess, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. You're not alone in this. Nina stood at the nursery window with Zara in her arms, looking out at the garden her children would grow up playing in, the house they would inherit, the foundation that would carry their grandfather's name long after she was gone. She looked at her reflection in the glass. No longer the woman sitting on a bedroom floor soaked in dirty water, but the woman who'd built something that would outlast every person who'd tried to take it from her. She smiled, not in triumph, not in celebration, just in peace.